Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Whitley Penn Talks. Today is the first in the series called Major Fundcast, which is our first ever public sector focused series. Today we've got Lupe Garcia and Celina Cereceres to take it from here. So I'll let you guys introduce yourselves and then get into the content.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in and listening to our first public sector podcast. My name is Lupe Garcia. I'm a partner in the firm in the public sector practice. I've been with the firm for 13 years. The entirety of my career has been spent working with local governments, cities, counties, school districts, community college, and other special purpose governments. Just to give you a little background on myself, I am a native Houstonian. That's somewhat rare these days because it seems like everyone in Houston is from somewhere else, but I was born and raised in North Houston. I attended all Dean ISD schools and I graduated from the University of Houston. I'm in public accounting and I'm a CPA, but I do not have an accounting degree, so that might shock a lot of people out there. My undergraduate degree is actually in finance from the Bauer College of Business. Fortunately, I was given an opportunity at the firm and I started my career as a staff auditor, and I went to school at night and the evenings on the weekends to get the hours I needed to take the CPA exam.
And I'm Celina Cereceres. I am not a native Houstonian. I actually transferred from El Paso, Texas. It's 14 years ago, actually, in a few days. It'll be 14 years, and I went to the University of Texas at El Paso, where I got my undergrad and my master's degree in accounting. My first firm was working with public sector clients. 5 years later, I moved to Houston, where I continued to work with public sector clients. I began working with Lupe Garcia in 2007. And we've worked with the same clients and love what we do, and we're just excited to be here today.
Okay, so a lot of you may not be familiar with the public sector, and so let's talk a little about what the public sector industry is and does and who they are. They're all around us. You may not realize it, but I'm sure we all live in the state of Texas, so we all live in a city, or we might be in an unincorporated part of the county, but these are all forms of government that provide a lot of the services that we use every day and sometimes take for granted because we just don't think about how water shows up at our house in our faucet. Or
especially right now during COVID-19, we really appreciate our teachers with all of the homeschooling that's happening.
Exactly. So the local governments are some of the largest employers in our area that rival some of the biggest companies that are headquartered in the state. The city of Houston, for example, has almost 22,000 employees. Harris County has 17,000 employees. We have some very large school districts in our area. Fort Bend ISD has nearly 10,000 employees. Katy ISD is also in the 10,000 range, and Pasadena ISD are 8,400. So local governments have a huge impact on our economy, on our daily lives, and we love it. That's why we do what we do and why we love working with our clients, and we're happy to bring this information to you in the form of this podcast.
Lupe, I think sometimes you tell our associates, or you I guess liken our cafeteria operations to restaurant operations. So kind of talk to us about that analogy, on just to put it in perspective, how many kids are fed on a daily basis throughout the state through our school districts, charter schools, even private schools, which are not really counted here in the Texas Education Agency. But if you were to incorporate even private schools, that would be a tall order.
I'm gonna have to give credit to Chris Bro, because this is a broism of his, an analogy that he likes to give, and it really hit home with me because I spent a lot of time in a restaurant working through school, and he likened all the cafeterias in a local area, in a local school district, to a restaurant chain. They're the largest restaurant chain in that area, serving 2 meals a day to tens of thousands of students in their local school district. And across the state, there's 5.4 million students receiving breakfast and lunch every day. So just those child nutrition service operations are a huge business in themselves.
Yeah, so we thank all of our public sector employees, and most of them, if not all, are considered essential personnel. And especially in light of COVID-19, we thank all of them for doing what they do and feeding the kids in the area, whether you're in the Houston Metroplex, in the El Paso area, in the Valley, or Austin, or DFW area. You all are doing a great job, and we thank you for that.
So, you mentioned COVID-19, Celina, with the coronavirus disruption and stay-at-home, work-from-home order. What our board of trustees, city councils having to do? How are they operating a little differently?
Well, but I know on all the board meetings or council meetings that we've attended virtually, the number one agenda item has been related to emergency procedures because of COVID-19. And so I believe most, if not all, councils and boards and board of trustees have passed their resolutions to forego competitive procurement procedures as it relates to COVID-19, specifically naming the crisis in their resolution. So that's important before you take alternative procedures for a lot of the things that you have to do to keep your businesses running. This resolution is critical, and whether you start applying for FEMA reimbursement down the road, this resolution will be key.
What about donations made by our local governments to local healthcare entities?
We've received this question quite a bit, and a lot of the hospitals are asking for medical supplies that are being used with the career and technical programs that the state funds or that's funded locally. So a lot of the high schools already have these medical supplies that they're using for educational purposes. So some of our school districts have asked, is this considered a gift of public funds? And so if you run the scenario through the 3-part test of gift of public funds, you'll see that it does pass because, one, it serves a public purpose. The district will have control over the goods that they're loaning or donating, and making sure that that's in writing. And then obviously the return benefit will be that it helps the community and indirectly or directly helps the students that may be affected by the virus. So what's essential here is to make sure that when you do donate or you loan any of these medical supplies, that you memorialize everything, whether if it's with another governmental entity, a governmental hospital, that you develop an interlocal agreement. If it's a private hospital, make sure that you involve your district attorney or your city attorney to make sure that you have the proper language in there. But this is obviously a time of crisis, and it's warranted, but documentation and all of this will be key.
So you mentioned documentation being key, and so that leads me to my next thought on record keeping. There's been a lot of legislation passed in the recent days and weeks, and hopefully local governments will be receiving some relief and some reimbursements for some of these coronavirus related expenditures. What should our local governments be doing to be able to track this internally in their general ledgers?
So we've received a lot of questions whether they should implement or develop new funds to track all of the expenditures specifically related to COVID-19, or they're using another identifier within their current account code structure. All of that is perfectly fine. The key is, again, Lupe, as you said, is documenting it, making sure that you can track it so that at any point you can run a query out of your financial software to show that. And just remembering that January 27th, 2020 is the day that COVID-19 became very relevant, and you could start tracking these expenditures for federal reimbursement, state reimbursement, etc. It'll be important for pre-award cost. It'll be important for the grant award cost when our grant applications are actually effective. And of course, procurement, any procurement procedures, documenting why you're foregoing any competitive procurement and invoking these emergency procedures will be key as well. And Lupe, also, let's talk a little bit about reimbursements as they relate to student payments for field trips. And this is specifically having to do with school district traveling or any other payments. What should our school districts, charter schools, be doing with those funds that they've collected so far?
You can hold it, record it as a liability, and when the time is appropriate, they can figure out how they're going to get those funds back to the respective families.
Yeah, you run the risk of not getting the checks mailed to the right address. They become stale checks, and then you have to follow other procedures. So yeah, that's one less thing to worry about. It's mainly an accounting issue that just needs to be dealt with in that way versus worrying about logistics and all of that.
Right. Another question we've received a lot is related to the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And so that allowed for emergency paid leave and sick leave that employees could be entitled to. And in the act, there was actually a provision for a payroll tax credit to help offset some of the cost that's going to be borne by the employers in providing this additional paid leave. Unfortunately for our governmental entities out there, this payroll tax credit is not applicable as of today. There's talk of making this payroll tax credit possibly extended to local governments, but as of today, April 10th, it is not.
Yeah. So I mean that brings us to other funding that is going to be available or is available to our governmental entities, specifically to educational entities, higher ed and K through 12. There's about $13.5 billion set aside specifically for K through 12 educational institutions, and then higher ed, a combo actually of higher ed and educational institutions of about $3 billion. The problem here in Texas, and ASBO International has published some interesting charts that, I think in the state of Texas, the amount of funding that we'll be receiving if we were to make it a per pupil number is only about $194 per student, which doesn't really amount to anything if you stop and think about it. So we not only have to think about what's happening at the state level. Governor Abbott has said that we're going to be facing a revenue shortfall at the state level. So you combine that with the issues related to COVID-19, and once you add the CARES Act funding, it probably won't make us whole.
Right. And if you think about the major revenue streams for our governments out there, property tax, sales tax, those are going to be impacted greatly. And there's a lot of uncertainty with property values, with property tax collections. Sales tax is going to be felt here in the coming months because that is received 2 months in arrears. But with all the restaurants closed, the hotels closed, the travel industry has been shut down, no entertainment, that sales tax revenue is going to dry up pretty significantly. So there's going to be a lot of cuts that are going to need to be made by our local governments.
Right. And so if we also think about what we should be doing from a K through 12 perspective as well is, I think it's going to be essential that you do track those expenditures like we talked about prior to this topic here. But if you remember back in 2009, under the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, or ARRA funding, they just added additional funding to the existing federal funds, and we had to figure out what the compliance requirements were applicable to this new funding. We anticipate that the confusion will be the same, so that's why we've learned from 2009, from that economic downturn and everything we had to do from an accounting perspective. So tracking is essential right now, and knowing exactly what you spent your funds on, especially when they bring on this additional CARES Act funding. It'll be really critical that we're able to identify those expenditures. Everything is in limbo, I think, especially with state funding. We're really not knowing how much will be available, especially through our K through 12s. And a little bit about me, I always make everything into a school district, no matter what it is. It's a thing of mine that everything becomes a K-12 or higher ed issue. But one of the things with House Bill 3 coming into play, that was a huge bill passed in the last legislative session. State aid is usually settled up. It's a process where the state determines how much has a school district earned and how much have we paid them. So does the school district owe us, or do we owe them any funds? That typically happens in September. This year, it may not happen as early as September. It may happen in October or November. So we're advising our clients to expect changes made to the accounting records later on in the year. It's going to be later than what we're accustomed to. So just being flexible with that. It's a year of, aside from COVID-19, House Bill 3 really did a number on the estimations developed by our school districts. So it's a year to be patient and just to know that we're all going through the same thing.
Right. We've talked a lot about coronavirus and its effect on accounting and financial reporting and operations, but a lot of our clients have been asking us, how is the financial statement audit going to be impacted? What's going to be different this year with the audit because of the coronavirus stay-at-home order? And the first one to mention is inventory observations. Our June 30 year ends are less than 2 months away, and their inventories, which would typically occur on June 30th or around that date, may not happen because of the stay-at-home order. So what are we going to do if it's a material balance? How are we going to observe or substantiate that inventory actually existed on that date? So there's been some thoughts and some guidance already provided. One thing we could do is perform the inventory observation at a later date, and then work backwards from that date as far as vouching the orders and the uses of inventory back to the financial statement date. Another one is using technology, using cameras and GoPros and being there virtually, but that poses some risks also with, are they truly at the warehouse that we want to verify inventory at, or is this an actual live recording, or was this recorded on another date? Hopefully this might be a moot point because of the coronavirus, operations have been impacted where they're not
inventory
low. May be at a low level, so it might not even be material to the financial statements.
And even if it's not material to the financial statements, a lot of our clients are saying, we don't want to end up in the newspaper that inventory went missing, especially when things are so weird right now. There are some fraud risks. So some of our clients have said, what if we select the 30 largest items and count those from the shelf, compare it to what's in the accounting records, and then go from the top 30 to what's on the shelf, vice versa, the reverse, and just counting the largest items to gain some comfort. What I've always been saying is just make sure that you document the key controls. How are you safeguarding the controls so that the bad actors within an organization don't take advantage of these weird times? And that's what's important. And I know a lot of clients are even changing their controls within their financial software because some of the campuses, for example, in a school district, the campus personnel are not allowed to be on site, but the administrative personnel are allowed. So a lot of those administrative personnel will have to assume those duties that the campus personnel have done in the past. So
you mentioned controls, and with everyone working from home, or most everyone working from home, the normal policies and procedures aren't being followed, and so the controls have changed since the last time we might have been on site performing the audit. So we're gonna have to gain an understanding what these new controls are. What are the controls that are in place now over disbursements, especially to employees and to vendors providing goods and services? Yeah. So that's going to impact our risk assessment and our test of internal controls also.
Yeah, and Lupe, if I can add another Chris Broism, that this is definitely not a time to play hide and seek, but it's a game of show and tell. I mean, this is when we need you all as clients, as the auditees, to tell us exactly what's happening, your concerns, to protect the organization. Because again, some things may not be material to the financial statements, won't affect the users, but whatever hits the newspaper is a big deal. It does make a big splash, so we've got to be careful with that.
Right. I have noticed over the years that everything is becoming more and more electronic, so that helps, given that a lot of us are working remotely. But we do have clients where it's still very paper-based, and so that's going to be a challenge to overcome if everyone's still working from home as we work through the audit. So access to books and records could be a challenge. I think what works best is when our clients are able to give us remote access, read-only access into their software system. That way we can look into the general ledger and see invoices and the transactions for our testing purposes.
That's right.
We already do this. So confirmations, we've been utilizing confirmations.com, which is an electronic form of confirming balances with financial institutions. So we'll continue to do that. We might have to include some additional representations at the end of the audit in the management representation letter. If there's anything related to the coronavirus or the disruption in operations or just any challenges or other factors that need to be
or even in
disclosed.
The management discussion in an LSE annual financial reports or comprehensive annual financial reports, just discussing the effects of COVID-19 on operations and perhaps if it is less than acceptable or if it's detrimental to the organization, an emphasis of matter paragraph would need to be added, and corresponding note disclosures too. So we'll have to keep an eye out for that. And right now we're talking about it, so we need to remember that when September, October, November come around for actual issuance of those items.
Right. I've also read some articles that reference that there might be qualified opinions for the first time ever if, for example, inventory can't be observed or there's some other form of audit evidence the auditor isn't able to obtain. So let's make sure we identify any possible areas of the audit where that might be a possibility and when we get that cleared up or addressed as soon as possible in the audit process.
Right. And so I think, we had two critical governmental accounting standards that were supposed to be implemented this year and in the next year. So GASB 84 has to do with custodial funds or agency funds prior to GASB 84. And GASB 87 was the lease pronouncement, which is the sister pronouncement to the corporate side of lease pronouncement as well. So there are talks that GASB will delay that. It's not official yet, but their exposure draft is their first teleconference to discuss this is April 14th with a follow-up teleconference on May 26th. So we should have clear guidance by that time. I wish it were sooner, but May 26th will have to do. And Lupe, you and I have been talking about, a lot of people have been planning for the custodial funds, for the fiduciary fund statements for over a year now, some for 2 years. So it's not that crazy to have to wait, or it's not that big of a relief. But perhaps it is one less thing to worry about if we do delay it. And then GASB 87 on the leases, I mean, that is a huge undertaking for those entities that are lessors and lessees and have significant lease agreements on there. So,
right. So there more than likely will be some relief there if our local governments need to take advantage of the extension on implementing those two standards.
Right.
So for this next part of the podcast, we're going to have a lightning round of some fun, fast facts about you and I. And so my first question for you is, what was your first car?
It was a 1992 white Chevy pickup, and I could only drive it to school and back. I lived 1.7 miles from the house, and that was the extent of my driving. And so it was uneventful for most of high school.
Okay. So since that first truck of yours, how many vehicles have you had in your lifetime to date?
Well, cars bring me a lot of emotional joy. And so between the age of 16 and a half to 40, I've had 17 vehicles. I went a little crazy starting at the age of 23 when I had my first job. Well, actually 22, my full-time job. Started buying my own vehicles and probably getting a new car every year. I had one blip where I had 2 cars in 1 year. It's an exciting year. What was your first car, Lupe?
So my first car was a 1994 Nissan Altima. It was a black 4-door sedan, very boring looking car. I got it when I was, I think I got it right before I turned 17. And so that was my first car. I worked I purchased that car because I had already worked and saved up enough money, and my parents helped me buy it.
Yeah. And for the listeners out there, Lupe is only a year in 10 months younger. So.
Right. So my total number of cars is 4.
A fraction of what
A fraction of the number of cars you've had. I think I've had 4 cars.
Yes, you have not lived, my
right.
friend. So,
well, before we get off the cars, what would you say your dream car is?
The RC 500, but I'm a terrible driver, so I don't know if that's a great choice for me. Quite dangerous. So maybe the RC 350 would be a good start. The Lexus RC 350. Yeah. What about you?
I would pick the Nissan Skyline GTR, the twin turbo V6 all-wheel drive. So that's the car I would want.
Goes fast, I take it?
It goes pretty fast. It's 11 seconds in the quarter mile if you live your life a quarter mile at a time.
So Lupe, I know you have 3 kids under the age of 5, so maybe TV watching is not high priority. So I do know you listen to a lot of books on Audible. So how many books would you say you've listened to in the last year or 2?
I checked this recently, and so I have 55 titles in my library, and I've probably listened to those 55 books over the last 2 to 3 years.
That's a lot. And
so,
what's the current book you're listening to?
So the current book I'm listening to is about the Civil War, but it's not always historical. I listen to fiction as well. So since I do spend a lot of time in the car, I want to make it as useful as possible. So that's where I get all my listening done, is in the car.
Yes, the commuting
in
Houston is is crazy.
Yeah, so listeners out there, if you haven't used Audible, I highly recommend it. It's especially when you're listening to books that are narrated by the author. Those are very entertaining as well.
Yep. So for me, I guess I only have an 11-year-old son, so I have a little bit more time compared to Lupe.
Yes.
So I've seen all seasons of All American. It was fascinating. Tay Diggs was awesome. So any sports show is amazing. So that was good. And then I stopped there. Always a fan of the Real Housewives of wherever. So when I need some brainless TV, just to turn off the brain, that's what I turn on. Yeah. Probably shouldn't admit that live, but that's what happens.
Yeah. Well, like you said, my 5-year-old and 3-year-old do control the television for the most part. But in those rare instances where I am able to watch what I want, which is typically after the midnight because they're asleep. Right. I'm either watching the YouTube channels that I subscribe to. There's actually a lot of good content on YouTube if y'all haven't checked that out. So there's a lot of automotive related YouTube channels I watch online. But as far as Netflix and streaming, currently I'm watching Money Heist. I believe that's the name of the series. Yeah. It's actually a Spanish series that they've dubbed in English. And it has my attention at the moment.
Okay, and what was your first job and at what age?
My first job was at Kroger, and I actually started my working there when I was 16. On my 16th birthday, I spent it at Kroger, my first day checking out groceries as a cashier at Kroger.
Yeah. And I think our parents share the same philosophy that they didn't want us working at a young age. So my first job was as a receptionist at the company my dad worked at. And parents were very against it because the fear was you're going to love money instead of education. So they were very against it, but we pushed through and we kept working for it.
I think being a cashier was appropriate because, from a very early age, I was reconciling on a daily basis my sales to the amount of cash that I took in. And within a year or so, I was promoted and I worked in the courtesy booth. So I was doing that for all the cashiers and selling money orders and lotto tickets and cashing checks and taking utility bill payments and selling money orders. I mentioned that.
Yeah. Oh, very nice.
Yeah. So it was a very good first job. I enjoyed it. Yeah. Since it was the grocery store close to where I lived, I saw, a lot of my friends, people I went to school with, neighbors would come through. So
it's very cool.
Yeah. And there was a manager that let me take cakes home at night.
Bonus.
Yes. I think it's because he wanted to take one home, so he wouldn't feel bad. He let me grab one too. So my family benefited in that way. We always had a cake on the kitchen table.
Very nice. All right. Well, for I guess our next podcast, we're hoping to bring Sarah Langlois she's a partner with KBS Law, and that firm specializes with public sector entities as well. She's a great resource, lots of fun, so we look forward to having her on our podcast. And so this is probably the only time that I'll be able to say, but I had a great time with my other pod because we're two peas in a pod on this podcast. So Lupe didn't want that title, so it was...
Right, that wasn't the name we were going to use, so she's getting it out of her system.
Yes, he said this was the first and last time I could use it, and so it's done. It's dead. It's out of my system. Right. Thank you.
Well, we want to thank all of you for tuning in and listening to our first episode in this series of our public sector podcast, Whitley Penn Talks. Celina and I will see you on the next one, and hopefully Sarah will be joining us as well.
Thank you.